What's up? Welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. I am currently in the middle of covering like 3 major stories. So I've got a lot of editing, research, contacts, phone calls to make. And honestly, like 2025 is already kind of shaping up to be one of the biggest years in terms of like the scope of some of the stories that I'm trying to cover. And it's a lot of stuff to work through, just mentally, obviously, but also just like the sheer amount of workload. Like, I started an interview yesterday for one of the stories I'm covering. It was about a 2-hour and 45-minute conversation, and it's the first of many just because of the scope of what we're talking about. So I'm going to be head down at my computer over the next like couple weeks, just really locked in working on these projects. And, when I get into periods like that, where it's like super busy, I usually like tend to do a couple episodes that are like just for me. And this episode is certainly one of them. It's far off the beaten path. And I talked to my guest today about it. I said, this is a little bit different than the stuff I usually cover, but also it's adjacent and might be interesting to some of my, fellow fundamentalist listeners. And I hope it is. But, this episode is, like I said, a little bit different. We get a little bit more into, literature, philosophy, theology. And so if that's stuff that's not really interesting to you, it's not what you're here for, feel free to skip this episode. No hard feelings. But I think a lot of people will actually think this episode's really fascinating, just like I did. Today, I'm sitting down with Liz Charlotte Grant. She is an award-winning writer whose work has been published in The Revealer, Sojourners, Brevity, Christian Century, Christianity Today, Hippocampus, Religion News Service, U.S. Catholic, Huffington Post, and elsewhere. That's a great, massive list there to show you kind of the pedigree of writing that she does. But she recently wrote a book that's called Knock at the Sky, and it is approaching Genesis from a more literary lens. And so this episode is by no means a Sunday school class. I'm not here to tell you what I think about Genesis because I have no clue. And Liz is approaching Genesis from the book of Genesis from the perspective of a creative writer. So she's really looking at just the literature of Genesis and, what she values in that text and things that concern her about the text. It's just a really open conversation. And again, it was just one out of curiosity for me. Like this episode, I'm asking questions and Liz in response is asking questions. And I thought it was a really fascinating dialogue. Again, off the beaten path of what I normally cover, but I think those episodes are what keep us sane sometimes, kind of sandwiched between some of the horrific stories that I'm covering on the show. Sometimes it's fun to just get a temp check on, what do we think about the Bible now? What do we think about spirituality now? What do we think about fundamentalism now? And wherever you land on that, I know I have people that are, biblical literalists and they look at the book of Genesis as a, historic text. I know I have people that, don't value the Bible whatsoever. I know I have people that are somewhere in the middle and don't know what they think and are kind of hesitant to broach these topics. And so, as someone who is largely agnostic myself at this point, the fact that Liz was able to communicate about this book from a literary perspective in a way that was fascinating and interesting to me in her book, I think is really cool and really special, and I appreciate it very much. Now, I do have to say, I am furious about one aspect of this conversation. There's one thing that I did in this conversation that made me extremely mad. In Liz's book, she talks extensively about whale song and how whales communicate with each other. And if you can see my shirt, you'll know where I'm going with this. But I literally wrote in my notes for the book, all the talk of whale song had me ready to revisit Star Trek 4 and Star Trek Prodigy because they bring this back. But I was like, how did I have a whole conversation with someone who's fascinated with the topic of whale song, has talked about it on a billion podcasts, and I didn't make one single Star Trek reference? She made a very minor Star Trek reference about something else later on, and it was just salt in the wound when I listened back to the recording. I was like, we could have had an in-depth Star Trek conversation, but I guess I'll have to wait for another day. But anyway, here's my conversation with Liz Charlotte Grant. Kick back, relax, listen to 2 people just trying to make sense of a several thousand-year-old text and, what applications or literary value it has for us today. And like I said, this isn't Sunday school. I'm not telling you what to think about it because I don't know what the heck I think about it. But this should be a really fun episode and a nice reprieve from some of the heavier topics that I talk about on the show regularly, especially gearing up to cover some of the bigger stories I've covered here on the Preacher Boys podcast. But that's enough from me. I need to get back to work. Here's my conversation with Liz Charlotte Grant, author of Knock at the Sky. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Liz, thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
I mentioned before actually jumping into the recording that this is a little bit off the beaten path of what I normally talk about. But also it's not. It's been an interesting thing, like over the last 5 years, having conversations about clergy abuse, having conversations about, people having this really fundamentalist approach to life and scripture and the world. And, it's led to some really interesting conversations. And this is one I think will be really interesting to people. I think some people will just like skip it completely. They'll be like, I don't want to hear about it. I want to just hear about this one specific thing. But this one's purely, I think, one for people like myself who are questioning, how do we want to engage with scripture? What role does it have, if any, in our lives? And I guess first and foremost, so people can get to know you, what's your context like with the church? Like, where did you start? I know you were like kind of evangelical. Like,
I was very evangelical, Eric. So
I say kind of because I heard you on a podcast say you didn't know you were evangelical. So
that's true. That is true. I did not know the word evangelical. Yeah. But I grew up in like a Bill Hybels evangelicalism. So kind of
evangelical.
Bill, yeah. So seeker sensitive. I kind of consider it like the Costco Christianity, the like big box variety. I think I always was really interested in the structure of it, the institution, as well as just being very involved. So I was like a youth group kid. I went to all the mission trips. Like I ended up at Wheaton College, which is this evangelical bastion. They like to think of themselves like that anyway. They told me it was the evangelical Harvard, which is why I ended up there.
Why not?
And I was like, if you have to call yourself Harvard, then maybe you aren't. But anyway, so yeah, I have some credentials within evangelicalism, but I think I never entirely fit. And in fact, even when I was trying to fit, it was clear that I was a little bit outsider. And part of that is being a strong woman. It is a challenge to be in churches and in spaces where strong women are threatening. And I think, I wonder if you had this experience, Eric, but kind of being someone who is naturally curious. I asked a lot of questions and I pressed on a lot of things. And I'm not very interested in kind of the big picture. I'm much more interested in kind of on the ground. How does this play out? What is the big picture theology that's up here? How does that actually play out on the ground? So my husband and I realized we thought we were complementarian for a long time, which is kind of the traditional patriarchal gender roles within a marriage. And then we looked around and said, the expression of this, like the median expression of complementarianism, looks abusive. Like there's a lot of abuse that can come here into these spaces because of this theology. So maybe actually it's a rotten theology, like maybe that's not the way we want to actually live our lives. And in fact, we weren't living that way. We were living a much more kind of equitable model of marriage. But I think, we had lots of questions. I had lots of questions from the beginning, but I think like many people kind of went through my own dramatic faith shifts, often related to real life experiences. And for me, one of those was going through therapy and realizing, I experienced some abuse in my family of origin. And that was a huge shift in kind of how I saw God and the Bible and church, and led me to some really different places.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was fascinating to me, and I'm just to give you like context, like I'm in such a weird place currently, and people who listen to the show know, like, I don't know what faith means to me at this point. And so even when your book was pitched to me by the publicist, I was like, do I want to talk about Genesis? Like, is that something I'm interested in doing? And I honestly was like, maybe not. And then I've recently started getting really I just get hyper fixated on something and I'm like, oh, I'm fascinated with all these conversations again. And I'm listening to all these discussions. And one of the books I started revisiting was Reza Aslan's book, God, which he talks about. And it's the part I keep re-listening to, is when he says, if you ask a child to draw a picture of God, they draw their dad, maybe with like a longer beard or something. And I'm fascinated with that because it's true. Especially for someone like myself whose dad literally voiced God in school plays here and there, it's like, that is how you view it. And I'm always fascinated when there is elements of abuse, whether emotional, physical, sexual abuse, how that distorts how you view a godlike figure. And that by itself can spark such a severe crisis of faith. And like, what does this mean to me? How did you view God during that time period? Like, how did those experiences with family affect how you view God? Whether it was your actual physical father or whether it was just family and authority, it had to have distort that picture in some way.
I have heard that kind of the first 5 years of life, and this, to kind of tack onto Aslan's hypothesis, the first 5 years of life form a child's view of God completely. I mean, that is, and it's their parents. They assume that. So I think I had a very dysfunctional view of God for a long time, where God was kind of this narcissistic, self-involved, wanted to kind of create the world in God's own image. Yeah. Because some of that I experienced in my family. And so I think that's very common for people. One of the things that became really important to me, though, as I went through faith shifting, was this idea of boundaries and realizing that God, kind of returning to the scriptures and saying, okay, what does God actually think of separation? What does God think of individuation? What do I actually see here from this deity? Do I see a deity that is hyper controlling, or do I see and kind of authoritarian, or do I see a deity that is open? And I think you can find a case for both in the scriptures, but I started to see these stories of, so for example, in Genesis 1, I used to see that as kind of an authoritarian sort of, making the whole earth in God's image. Every creature is about God. And in fact, what I began to see over time, kind of spending time with this story, is that the story of Genesis 1 is a story of individuation. It is separation. It is kind of individual beings being allowed to be separate, to have free will, to divide from God, to divide from each other. And there's actually a lot of freedom to do that. I think the passage that comes to my mind a lot is this question of, what happens at the end of time. So in the book of Revelation, there's this, it's this kind of wild apocalyptic rendering of the end of the world. And, kind of seems like a hallucinogenic dream. But right at the end, when judgment is foretold, Jesus, who is the bringer of that judgment, is knocking on the door and saying, invite me in. I stand at the door and knock. That to me was really compelling, a compelling image, because you imagine kind of an FBI raid, right? Knocking down the door. And instead you have this bringer of judgment who's patiently waiting to have the door opened. And that's a fascinating image. But I kind of saw that pattern continue throughout Genesis, where, Genesis 6, God regrets having made humankind. And that's kind of when you have several of these interventions that are really famous: Noah and the flood, you have the Tower of Babel, you have, several of these kind of big interventions that God, where God intervenes with humankind because of humankind's evil, presumably. And yet God doesn't destroy immediately. And one of the things that was really amazing was, as I turned to alternative sources. I grew up with the dead white guys telling me what the Bible meant.
Yeah.
But as I turned to these alternative sources, these kind of marginal voices, I learned actually that there was a whole tradition that said Noah was meant to be the street preacher, and he preached for 150 years for the people of Babylon to repent before the flood. And so a lot of this kind of shifted, like the timeline shifted, kind of my understanding of God shifted. Now, do I think like the flood should have happened? I don't know. I hope not. I hope it didn't happen. But I think it shifted the type of judgment that I saw, because I saw this kind of level of patience that I hadn't understood before.
And this is the tension that I feel and I know it's informed because I'm a former fundamentalist and I was raised with a very stringent view, is and I was listening, for context, I've been going down this rabbit hole of all these conversations. I was listening to Alex O'Connor's interview, debate, whatever you want to call it, with Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson, who have complicated feelings about both of those figures. But there was a point at which Peterson was kind of really pushing the symbols, and whether the narrative's true or not, the symbols are so important and valuable, and starting to form for Peterson a very coherent thought about something I think is interesting, which is really what you're proposing in the book, is like, what can we learn from this, regardless of like let's put our foot down, this is black and white true, this is valuable. And Dawkins was really pushing, I'm not interested in symbols, I'm interested in fact. You're drunk on symbols, like you're worried about this.
I'm not that interested in symbols. I think, Dr. Peterson, you're drunk on symbols.
Yes, you mentioned. I've heard that comment. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, for example, I counted up in your book, We Who Wrestle with God, a number of references to Cain. Mm-hmm. There are 356 references to Cain in the book, and 20 references to the descendants of Cain. You're obsessed with Cain because Cain is symbolic of evil. All the evil in the world, you more or less blame Cain for. And this is Cain. I mean, you don't believe Cain actually existed, I presume.
Well, I think of Cain as, well...
Do you believe Cain existed?
I think the pattern that Cain represents is an eternal pattern. And so it's a higher level of existence.
That's different. I realize that.
Well, there are Cain types who exist, and there
there are Cain types. But Cain himself, I mean, you give the game away where you say in your book, Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born in the natural way. Now that betrays you as it were pretending you think they really existed, because you wouldn't have said they were born in a natural way unless you were muddling up facts with symbols there, because you don't think that Cain and Abel existed.
Well, I don't. What do I think about Cain and Abel? I said, I think the pattern that they represent always exists. Always exists.
You understand that that's a different thing.
What's a different matter? A pattern that they represent, the conflict between brothers, the rivalry between brothers. This is a fundamental pattern, which yes, it's something that's there. But I care about facts. I mean, did they exist or did they not exist?
Well, I can imagine a situation where when the story was originated, that it referred to two actual brothers. But as the stories propagate across time, as they mutate, as they adapt, let's say, to the structure of human memory, they deepen and they become broader. And so then they become emblematic not only of the pattern of conflict that might characterize the original two brothers that the story was about, but about the conflict between brothers as such, and then the more fundamental levels of conflict that exist within human beings, which is what you see in more sophisticated literature. It's like the biblical accounts speak of fact in a factual manner upon occasion, but the biblical accounts also speak poetically and metaphorically and allegorically, and people who are sophisticated in biblical analysis have known this for centuries. The biblical literalists generally suffer from the problem that they don't even know what it means to be literalist. There's lots of unsophisticated ways of approaching a text.
Okay, let's see what Professor Dawkins thinks about that.
Well, I suppose I'm a literalist. I mean, and And you give the game away when you say Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born in a natural way.
And I found myself in that moment. I was like, this is the tension I feel inside, where I go, I need the black and white. Did this happen? Did this not? Who is God? What does he want from us? And there it is. And then the other part of me is like, this is such a beautiful narrative. There are things that can be taken from it, but those things seem to cancel each other out. Like, I guess like stepping away from the Bible and getting ready to step back into it. Like, how would you encourage people to go like, I'm looking for this. When I go into this, I'm looking for this thing. Is it science? Is it truth? Is it reality? Is it just the symbols? Do we look at it like Shakespeare or like, the Odyssey, like you mentioned in your book? Like, how do you recommend stepping into it with a blank slate, trying to wash away that fundamentalist mindset or whatever we already have instilled into us?
I'm a creative writer. I am not a theologian. And that means that I approach this text really differently.
Mm-hmm.
Like I approach from this native place of symbol. So like if anyone is drunk on symbol, it is me.
And that's why I was curious, like your perspective on that. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I resist the questions of historicity about Genesis because I think the only way we have read Genesis, truly the only way, has been through a lens of historicity. Is this science? Is this fact? Did this, is this cosmology? Are we reading cosmology?
Yeah.
I think that is a very uninteresting question, just to be very honest with you, because first of all, I think the people who've tried to answer that question have not understood the text very well. So for the most part, like they don't understand the complexity of the ancient Near East when, Genesis was written, sort of the Iron Age. It's like, this is a primordial text in some ways. It is describing primordial people and events. So whether they happened or not, this is an account that has been valuable to people over time. So our ancestors have found this text to be valuable. That is a good starting point, I think, for us to think about Genesis and the Bible as a whole. I'm not really an apologist in any way, even for the Bible, even for Genesis. And the reason is I think it's been used as a weapon. And it's such a potent weapon in the culture wars. I mean, it's really been used to bludgeon people. I don't think everyone should probably read Genesis. Like, this is not a book for people who have been told that they are less human from the pages, right? And yet, I think that ancient wisdom is worth considering. And so, however that comes, whether it's myth, whether it's fact, I think that is kind of an unimportant question. I think the question that is important is, what did our ancestors see in this text? And what does that mean for us? What kind of ancestral wisdom can we take from this? I'm interested in how it informs our lives, but I'm not somebody who like wrote a formula at the end of each chapter to try to tell you how to live based on a book that's in parts 4,000 years old. Like I'm not. Right. That's not my inclination. And in fact, I think that can be a harmful inclination. I tend to be a person who trusts my reader, or I guess a writer who trusts my reader, but I try to kind of live in such a way that I trust the people around me. Like, we are adults. That means we're responsible for what we do. It also means we're responsible for the conclusions we draw, the way that we live, how we engage, and I trust my reader to be able to discern kind of what this actually means for themselves. But yeah, I don't think that hasn't historically been a evangelical trait, like trust in other people.
Trusting the reader to determine what they think. Yeah.
I think, in fact, that's been fundamentalism in a nutshell, right? Like, it is authoritarian by nature.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I feel like I bristle against, I find myself always going, well, then what's the point? Like, what's the point of this? And I will say as a compliment to your book, and I hope I'm not sounding critical. I hope I'm not sounding too critical of your book itself, but
no, not at all.
It was challenging to me in the sense of it made me set aside the desire for, is Ken Ham right about the age of the earth, which is the historic conversation in evangelicalism. to go, okay, looking at the text as a piece of literature, just as a literary work, what can I glean from this? And I think your book does that remarkably well in terms of like the highest praise I can give the book is that it felt like a great literature teacher walking me through a really fascinating piece of mythology. And I think that's really the goal of the book is like reapproaching Genesis in that way.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like you mentioned the inherent value this has had for thousands of years. And also it's been used as a weapon for thousands of years. Do you think there's something we can do with the information and the fact that this has been valuable to people solely as a weapon for thousands of years? And how does that affect our modern reading? Because I think there's ways you can go in and have a very charitable reading of God, a very charitable reading of humankind. There's ways you can go in and go, people of these races are really bad. Like we've heard some extreme extrapolations from scripture. So like, how much does the historical value inform your current value? Or are you wiping some of that clean and then going in with fresh eyes? Like, what's that process look like for you?
As I mentioned, being a creative writer, I didn't feel the same pressure to approach like a commentator would. So I didn't actually approach with kind of everything on my back, having to kind of address every single question that the text raised. For me, it was very much about, I'm interested in the question of encounter and origins. Mm-hmm. So, this is a story of origin, right? This is the Hebrew story of origin, and it's been adopted by other cultures, including our own, especially white American evangelicalism. And so that was interesting to me. But what I realized is it's really a story about kind of individuals encountering a deity. They have this kind of encounter, and God is the one that makes first contact most of the time. So in sci-fi, first contact is like an alien term. It's like we have the first contact with this new species that we've never met before. It's very Star Trek. But I think thinking about it in terms of God being the one making contact with us as a new and different species of being, I think that's a really fascinating new lens. And so I actually wanted to, I am a Christian still. I'm a progressive Christian, whatever that means. I mean, that means something different for everybody. But I think I believe the New Testament. So I believe in Jesus Christ. So I knew I could kind of come to this Genesis text with that lens, but that it would be a lot less interesting.
Yeah. Right.
So I really wanted to come and say, okay, what does it look like to just encounter what's here? Like these exact words, this story, these characters, these themes, without bringing in any other part of the Bible to the best that I could. What does it look like to just encounter the words right here, to play literary critic to these particular sentences and characters, Yeah. And so for me, that felt very true to the actual story, because they are also encountering this totally alien deity who is just showing up and speaking. Yeah. That's really different and unique, even in kind of a mythological mode. It doesn't always happen like that. And there's so many parts of the Bible that are kind of annunciations where God shows up and makes some proclamation about somebody's life. And then you kind of watch to see what happens. Like, does this happen? And what does it mean? And how does it change them? And how does it change the way they interact? Does it actually make it come about because God has said it?
Yeah.
And kind of how do you deal with the mismatch there when it doesn't happen? The story of Abraham and Sarah is like Abraham. Abraham hears this voice from God kind of out of the blue. The King James, it's so great. It says, "Get thee out." That's God's command to Abraham. Get thee out. Just so forceful and punchy, right? And the man, we don't hear anything about his internal dialogue whatsoever. He just rolls up his rugs and caravans out into the desert. Leaves his homeland, his home deities, his tribe. I mean, this was everything in the Iron Age, and he leaves. And so there's this kind of question there about why. One of the things, that is important to understand too is that God made promises. So God promises land and inheritance and children. He and his wife are infertile. And so that was probably the most important thing to solve for them was, we need fertility. In order to continue our line, we need fertility. So I'm willing to kind of give up whatever inherited deities I used to have if this new one could give me fertility. And God promises that God will do it in Sarah's body, despite the fact that she's like postmenopausal and all, all this stuff.
Yeah. You mentioned that in the book, like that she laughs, but it's because, and we read it going, well, it's God, like he'll do it, but then you read it from her perspective and you're going, there's no precedent for this. Like it's a very bizarre proposition. And I heard so many sermons about her lack of faith and how, horrible she was for not trusting God. And it's like, if you look at the context of that situation, it was preposterous. Like she didn't have 66 books of evidence that this will happen. She didn't have the ending of her own story. And I thought that was really fascinating in your book, that piece, because it gives a lot of insight into her that is not there, particularly from a male perspective who hasn't gone through any of those things, reading through that text.
I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about Sarah is she is both really misunderstood from the perspective of being a woman, but also from the perspective of dealing with Hagar and kind of the ways that she perpetuates abuse against this enslaved woman in her household. And so it's a very complex story. And I think actually that's part of the reason that I felt attracted to writing this story. It was very challenging to deal with these characters because they are, a lot of the things they do kind of offend my sense of rightness and fairness. And I feel really angry at them. I feel like a lot of the ways that Christianity has understood, for example, Father Abraham is kind of like, they have kind of made all these excuses, like he's a mega church pastor that, with his crisis management team, they're like trying to kind of blow over whatever it is, big crisis. And that is very offensive to me. And there's a lot that's offensive in these pages. But I think what was so interesting is that it was a very psychologically true picture. As you kind of get in the weeds with these characters, you really get a sense of kind of their complexity. Mm-hmm. And I found that really fascinating for such an old book. Like I found it really interesting to be able to get that close to somebody who, at least a character who was written so many thousands of years before me, and being able to kind of see some version of myself in them, even if, I ultimately disagree with their actions and where the story goes and,
Yeah.
But the psychological truth was really fascinating.
I have two questions, really. I mean, the characters is a fascinating piece, but there's also the interaction with God in these passages. And I know for people listening, well, I could have two questions. I have one about the morality of God, and I have one about the existence of. Which one do you want first? And we can build on those.
Let's start morality. Let's go for it.
So there's people who would read the Bible, and I think like the common argument is, if God's the one dictating this, one, why didn't he be a lot more clear? Like, why do we have to go into this and figure this out and extrapolate all this information? I was reading something the other day and someone said, why didn't he write this on a piece of indestructible metal, his words, this is what I want to say, instead of on scrolls and verbal tradition and all the, hodgepodge ways that it's been cobbled together. But then the other piece is, God being this moral being, he allowed so many immoral things. At least we perceive very immoral things throughout, especially the Old Testament, like slaughtering the women and children in these groups. And some apologists say, well, they had it coming, like this, they deserve this to happen.
Now, the more difficult problem is the children. How could God command that the children be killed because these are innocent? The death of these children meant their salvation. They were the recipients of an infinite good as a result of their earthly phase of life being terminated. The problem is that people look at this from a naturalistic perspective and think life ends at the grave. But in fact, this was the salvation of these children and would be far better for them than continuing to be raised, say, in this reprobate Canaanite culture.
And others say that's not quite how it happened. That was them doing it, assigning it to God. I guess, like, you still remain a progressive Christian. Why do you view this particular God worth following versus, say, any other religion where there might be more perceived morality? Or, like, how do you solve that problem, I guess, in your mind?
So there's
very
kind of
easy,
two questions
simple
in
question.
that. Yeah. I got it.
30
Check.
podcasts with.
I don't mind. So the first question is kind of, why didn't God make God's self more understandable? Why do we have the Bible instead of a clear kind of cut into metal, like welded, understandable way of encountering God? So that actually to me is a really interesting question. Because, one of the things that people assume is that God wrote the Bible.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people assume that, whether they're Christian or not. Some sort of deity wrote this text, this sacred text. I think that's an interesting way to read the text, but I don't know that it is true of how books are made. And so a lot of my book tends to be kind of poking at this idea about authorship, like who actually wrote the Bible and how did it come to us, and what does that actually, how does that change the way that we see this text and apply it? If we think that people were more involved, does that actually make it less authoritative? What level of authority does art typically have over our lives? Like that's an interesting question in itself, right? Like, I think it's easy to assume that art and literature are kind of the least important pursuits of humankind. And in fact, they're some of the most persevering pursuits of humankind. And I find that really interesting. I find it really interesting, in times when we could just have focused on food and water and shelter and reproduction, we also made time for art, including 37,000 years ago, the Chauvet Cave. There were shamans who spent time in the dark drawing into rock, with ashes. It's just fascinating to me. So I think the fact is, art has this kind of appeal across centuries and this power across centuries. Whether it's because God was involved in the Bible, I tend to think yes, that there's some kind of level of muse inspiration, kind of magic God dust on the pages, but I can't begin to tell you how.
Yeah.
And in fact, I don't think anyone can.
Yeah. You can broadly
what I
say
find
inspiration, but that's a very broad. Many things are inspired,
right?
What does that mean?
Exactly. And I don't think actually anyone can succinctly describe what they mean, because it is, it can range from literally the gospel writers are possessed to, God put an idea in somebody's head, or I mean, there's just a whole range of how it could go. I tend to find it a lot more interesting to think about the Bible as a very human work. These experiences of God were so important to these people that they wrote them down. Probably God was involved in the inspiration of that, but it's much more true, at least to my life experience, both as a writer and as a human with a relationship with some sort of divinity, which in itself is a wild claim.
Yeah.
But I think it's truer for me to say that they had some encounter and then they tried to put it onto paper, or that they had some kind of other purpose about describing the encounters of other people, which is one of the reasons I talk about this as ancestral wisdom, because I do think there was a sense here that these people found this so important that they continued to pass it down across centuries. Yeah. Whether it was because of authoritarian control, a desire to kind of control other people, or whether it was for the sake of beauty and for, because they saw it as important for other reasons. It could be a ton of different reasons, and likely is that people continue to pass this work down. But again, I find that interesting to explore, why did we pass this down? Because it took so much effort and cost and time for this work to get to us.
Yeah.
In human labor and in ingenuity and innovation, all the ways that we kind of take advantage and kind of assume that writing is so easy.
Right.
It was near impossible in their age when this was written. So that's one part of this. You were asking about the morality of God, right?
Yeah, I think there are some who read Genesis and they read things that, like you said, make them upset, or God, at the very least, if God didn't ordain certain things, permitted things to happen. And again, this is a question people have been arguing about for thousands of years. But this is the part that I really wrestle with, is that, there are so many stories that are stories. The Odyssey is a great example. You mentioned the book. It predates, the book of Genesis, but there's so many relevant things and themes that resonate with us today. But that story now we don't view as being a historical account. Like Zeus is not here. These figures are not here. When it comes to tying into a real living faith in a God that we, claim to believe in, it can be difficult, I think, to separate those two things. Like the descriptions of God in the Old Testament to most everyone are like hard to comprehend. So I guess like how, of all the faiths you could put your like tent in, why the campground of Christianity? I've heard, I've seen naked pastors, meme where he says, I have many, tents, but like my main is Christianity. I'm curious, like why that one as home, and why not viewing that as just another example of someone trying to understand the human experience. And again, that's a super complicated question that you could write a whole book about. But I'm curious, like kind of your thought on it.
Yeah.
This is my biggest question for all progressive Christians, honestly. And I've listened to a lot of interviews, and I don't feel like I've ever heard that asked, like, why Christianity? Yeah. Because Muslims have tried to figure this out for years. Like Buddhists have tried to figure, like we've all tried to figure it out. Is it because that's the aesthetic that you're most familiar with? Like, what is it that brings you back to Christianity as a concept?
That's a fascinating question. Relating to the morality of the Bible and the God there, I think a lot about this question of free will. That can feel like a cop-out to people. But I find, like I was expressing before, I find it to be a really essential piece to any religious experience. Being able to deconvert is the way that it's not like a spiritual kidnapping, like a religious Stockholm syndrome. So to me, being able to have people completely reject God with either their actions or their words or whatever that is, that to me feels extremely important for this deity who wants this untethered love. Like this deity, I believe, wants this untethered love. So that's kind of the first part there. Why Christianity? I mean, that's a great question. I'm not always sure. The truth is that I have lots of questions and have found beauty in other religious answers. I will say, I grew up with this. So that is a very big part of it for me, feeling like this is my kind of inherited tradition, and it's being like able to kind of make
of that.
And being able to kind of make sense of what is this and what is a more pure, quote unquote, form. Some people talk about true and false Christianity. I find that kind of unhelpful. But it's compelling for me personally. I don't think like we don't have to make excuses for the false Christianities, in my opinion.
Sure.
Right. They're just wild and false and wrong and whatever. But I don't feel like I personally have to kind of point it out every time. So one is kind of like reckoning with my own heritage and the narratives that I've been given. I think these narratives too continue to shape me. Stories that we tell ourselves, they resound across generations. I mean, this is a generational faith that we've inherited. And often for many of us who grew up white American evangelical, we inherited this faith directly from parents, from grandparents. And the narratives that they kind of passed on to us continue to shape who we are. So that's a pretty compelling reason for me to continue to dig into this as well, to say kind of what level of storytelling related to the Bible, related to Christianity, has shaped my family and my family's story over time, over generations. I think beyond that, I will say that I know that people read the Old Testament and see an abusive Old Testament God.
Yeah.
And I completely understand. In fact, I write about that in the book, where it's reasonable for people to see that and to read that in the scripture. I think I don't read the scriptures in the same way anymore. So for me, it doesn't feel like that is the only way to interpret God. And so I think I probably have never found myself in a fundamentalist camp in my own brain. Like, I've been in those settings, but I myself have never felt compelled or controlled by that. And so I think I've always felt like there are ways to kind of center and marginalize different parts of this text forever. We've always done this. Like, every single piece of art probably has, especially one as old as this, which is a library, a multivocal library with so many different voices and opinions and versions even of what this deity is like. So many people trying to make sense of how God interacts with the Hebrew people, and then also who God is. There's these kind of ongoing conversations even within the text itself. So that to me has always felt kind of encouraging. Like, maybe different writers don't agree with each other, even in the Bible. And so does that mean I can also disagree? I think yes. Right.
Well, you mentioned the book, reading the Bible is necessarily interpretative, which is, it is. It is such a, like, you approach it, and the fact that there's so many, I forget how many denominations of Christian there are.
I know.
And not just Christian religions that pull from scripture, that right. are influenced by these texts. Like, they all interpret it based on their context. And that's what's interesting to me when I do find myself debating people who make claims about the morality of the Bible, is I'm like, there are things in the context of the time that the Bible was written that were radical for the time period. Like, you can look at Paul as a modern day misogynist, or you can look at him as an ancient feminist, depending on how you interpret text. Like, there's a lot of interesting pieces like that. Yeah. I know we could talk about that ad nauseum, but I want to ask this one potentially last question, depending on how long of an answer it is. But I was interested in your book. You quoted Augustine quite a bit, and Augustine's Confessions is a book that I've pored over many times, and one of the reasons is because he wrestles so openly with concepts that he does not understand. And I think you can sense this, like, pain almost of, like, his religious experience. Like, what does this mean? Like, I want to understand it. And I'm curious, because there's a quote, Augustine's famous for saying, which is that our heart is made for thyself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in thee. And I was kind of putting that in my mind next to your quote, which is, knock loudly, reject answers that do not admit complication, seek the resonance at the base of the story. The seeking is the point. And I guess when it comes to encountering God, what does that mean to you? Because I think what Augustine hints at is that there's this moment where you can almost wrap your arms around God, like, this is who God is. But also, he admitted there were things like the Trinity he would never fully comprehend. Do you think that encountering God will ever mean grasping him, or do you think that encountering God is purely the pursuit? Like, do you think that is the highest form of worship, is pursuing understanding, even if we never scratch the surface? Like, what does encountering God mean to you?
Well, I write about holy lightning in in the book because there's this great quote from a rabbi who I'm not going to remember at this moment. I'll look it up in a bit, but he writes about kind of the prophets having gotten these glimpses of God, kind of these flashes of light. And sometimes we get a glimpse and sometimes we don't. I was very interested in this rabbinic perspective on what it actually means to live out faith, because they tend to lean toward a model that says wrestling is the point. Mm-hmm. So they kind of take the story of Jacob wrestling in the dirt with God, or the angel, or whoever, whatever. They take that and they say, this is the life of faith in a nutshell. This is the goal. This is the pursuit. This is the way that we encounter. And we probably come away limping, and we may not have an encounter like that again, but the encounter is worthwhile. I think for myself, I have gone through many iterations of different types of belief. I've had kind of more charismatic seasons of my life. I've had, more prophetic times just personally. But I think in this phase of my belief journey, my spiritual journey, I have come to this place where I feel very patient with pursuit. And I don't think it's reasonable to say we could wrap our arms around what a deity even is or means. I think we can try, and we might get those glimpses, like we might touch the hem of a robe, but I think that's kind of the point of a deity, though, right? No. Is that kind of mystery, right. And the beyondness. That to me actually feels very important, especially in a season like ours politically and in this
is something
world.
Going on right now?
I don't know. I've heard rumors.
There's a couple things happening, I think.
I think when we feel powerless, it feels important to be able to connect with some sort of power. One that we can't control and that is bigger than us and is beyond us. I think for me, that's felt very important to say there are injustices in this world that may not ever mend, but I can trust that there is a deity who cares and will intervene eventually. Now, is that 150 years from now? Is that, thousands of years from now? I think that's kind of why I believe in God the way that I do. I believe that if Jesus has really conquered death, if Jesus has really resurrected, which is its own question in itself, that's someone who is more powerful than me, certainly. And I need that kind of power and justice to exist in the world, to exist in the cosmos, to make this life mean anything. So I think that's where I'm probably coming from on that.
Yeah. Well, it sounds similar. There's those that describe the evolutionary benefit of religion. Like if you're looking at from a perspective, like an evolutionary perspective, Dr. Brian Klaas talks about this. Richard Dawkins talks about this. Like there is some value to that. And I think what I've thought about in terms of divinity, and it's why I don't say I'm an atheist, I would say agnostic, is like, I feel like if there is unknowingness about why and what and how, and you have to believe something, it feels like it's much more. And I think it's for certain types of people that feel this way, because I've talked to people who feel the opposite, who are like, it doesn't help me at all to feel that way. But like, there has to be something greater than this that is over this in some way, or that is going to make this right in some way. And I think that is so much more powerful than looking into the void and going, I don't know, and I think also like that unknowingness is kind of what God is, from my understanding, is like the thing we don't understand. And you mentioned early on in your book, or maybe it was a podcast I was listening on, but you talk about God speaking the world into existence and asking, like, does God have vocal cords? And it's such a beautiful picture to me of the minute you even assign a name to God, you're anthropomorphizing him. There you go. Him or it or whatever it is, and putting it into language that we can understand. And like, there's such a delicate balance of being in awe of never being able to understand it while also putting it into literary forms that we can. It's just an interesting thing. And again, it's something that it's why I've been fascinated. Like Dr. Stephen Hassan, who's a cult expert, I talked to him about his Jewish faith, and like he talks about those debates people have and like this, unknowingness and this, what does this mean? Wrestling with it. I think it's so fascinating. And I think your book does a really great job of like instilling that desire to wrestle with it a little bit more.
Good art should make us do that, right? It should kind of disrupt us and kind of disturb us and make us uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that's very much the point of this book, is like, how do we make the familiar strange again? Right. So that we can be reacquainted with mystery.
Yeah, I love that. Making the familiar strange. Yeah, I mean, it's the reason Christopher Nolan is making a movie about the Odyssey in a year or two. Like, we've been telling this story a long time, but there's still truths to claim from it. I really appreciate this conversation. I know we're near the end of our time. People can obviously go pick up a copy of your book wherever books are sold. What's on the horizon for you? I love asking this question. People who've put all this work and time and effort into a project, and then you're like, what's next? What's coming up? But I'm curious, like, are you expounding on this kind of thread? What's on the horizon for you?
Yeah. Next is a book on the prophets. So that will be my next project. Nice. Just feels like the time for it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having this conversation. Hopefully it's not our last, because there's hours and hours of discussion I think that could be had on this topic. But thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Eric.